Hello, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Okay, thank you. So yeah, thank you for coming to this splendid majlis. I can say this ahead because of our guest, and I have actually written my introduction, so I will read it. I've known Robert for many years. His works are part of my teaching at all levels, from undergraduate to PhD. He's a leading scholar in our field, especially late antique Arabia and early Islam, explored in a global context. I had the joy to meet him in various academic settings, such as conferences, job interviews, and a PhD viva. He's always been a very vivid and individual incarnation of the British ideal of a perfectly polite and generously supportive gentleman who always expresses everything in the form of a quiet and often spirited understatement. So I've learned to pay much attention when he says anything. He's also someone who seems to reach the peaks of academia thoughtlessly. This reminds me again of the idea of a Renaissance gentleman or gentiluomo who produces scholarship at the highest level just out of curiosity and joy. I'm most excited to hear what he'll tell us about his own journey and research today. Thank you for coming. Please.
Thank you very much, Istvan. That's a very nice introduction, much nicer than when people recount achievements or books. I meant to try and learn how to use this thing because people told me this is very good microphone, but let me know if I'm not clear, because I know particularly from being in America that people consider me very quietly spoken. So I have to, the first thing I learned actually in America, going to Starbucks, if I just quietly, they ask your name to write on the coffee cup, so I quietly say Robert. And they come up with like weird names. What, Jim? What you say, Nicholas? So I always now say, my name's Robert, and a nice good. So I know how to speak if necessary.
We can hear you very well. We can hear you very well. Thank you.
Great. Well, I'll say a little about my journey. I can see there's some great papyrologists in the audience. I'm sure they want to hear about my papyri as well, and I'd like to have feedback. But it's easy to start my journey because it begins immediately with Professor Patricia Kroner, and she's been there even after her death, kind of in my mind and spirit, because she was such an inspiring person. So at 18, I arrived in Oxford just to do general Oriental studies. Mainly, I actually loved languages. I actually stopped doing history at the age of 14, but you had to do some basic. It was a very rounded sort of degree, whereas you picked 3 languages. I did Arabic, Persian, and Aramaic, and then you had to do literature, history, poetry, other sorts of courses. So Patricia with history, and then I was pretty much hooked from the first course because she was extremely inspiring. It was a very nice course that she and Fritz Zimmermann did together on the formation of Islam. And they made a very nice pair together. Fritz was much more quietly spoken, but very sharp, and also joined in debates very well. So it was amazing for us as 18-year-olds hearing these 2 greats of early Islamic culture can debate together. Probably the next step is when I start my PhD, which I never intended to do. It's funny looking back, but it never occurred to me for a second during my undergraduate degree to do further research. So I went out into, did some international banking and things, but probably only took me about a couple of months to discover that I'm not a 9-to-5 office person. So that nicely cut out 90% of other careers. So I wrote to Patricia and said, hey, do you think I could come back? And the nice thing about a PhD, especially then, where we didn't used to have to fulfill any requirements of residency or courses, you could very much just explore. So I traveled a lot, had a nice trip to Jordan and spent a year there just wandering around archaeological sites and got very much more hooked on archaeology. And then went to Princeton for a visiting year, which was very nice because I saw Michael Cook, and Peter Brown was particularly good at. I used to meet him every other week for lunch. And I see Garth Fowden here, and Garth I also met. I remember actually probably with some embarrassment because I must have seemed like a very upstart graduate student. I remember having a lively discussion with Garth, probably overstating my my credentials, but it was a very good time for making me think about late antiquity and the reality of how Islam emerging out of this late antique environment and what that really means, just thinking about gradual evolution, because Islamicists tend to go backwards. We start with our 9th and 10th century sources and we try and look back what's happening in the 7th. But it, obviously, historically, in terms of time, I know it's meant to be secular, but as far as we know, it seems to keep on going forward. I haven't got any younger anyway. So going forward from late antiquity was really quite a good way to think about it. And obviously people like Garth and Peter Brown were so amazing for getting you to think really much bigger and much grander theoretical ways that this was very influential for me. After finishing my thesis, so my thesis very much, I read Hagerism at the age of 18, first found it difficult to understand, but kept at it, and it just so much inspired me that I wanted to test whether it was true. I think sometimes people have thought my PhD was about refuting Hagerism, but it definitely wasn't. It was more about trying to assess how valid it was to use just non-Muslim sources or not. But having done that, I suppose I wanted to try different approaches. So I got into Arabic epigraphy. That was the next thing for me. And I spent a number of happy months in the Middle East doing epigraphic surveys, particularly nice one in Syria at Jabal Sais, which is to the southeast of Damascus, and an amazing lava outcrop with big volcanoes. So I kind of camped out there for a few weeks. As you get older, you'll realize you start one thing and you think maybe it'll just be a quick thing. I was going to just write an article, and I did write the article on Arabic inscriptions, but you kind of, it takes you down a whole road, an avenue which will probably take you a while before you ever get out of it again, because there's so many interesting things along that avenue. And doing more on epigraphy led me also into the history of Arabia, and thinking again, the idea of going forward, let's think about, rather than the rise of Islam, seeing if we focused on the Hijaz, going forward from antiquity, and then the broader Arabia. And that led to my second book on Arabia and the Arabs. And again, a lot of epigraphy. The other source that I thought of using was papyri. And that's going to be ultimately has led to this talk today. Because the thing that I love both about inscriptions and papyri is the materiality of them. These are texts written by these people at this time. We get them preserved in time. It's a fantastic thing. You can add the papyri, even more amazing. You can actually pick them up and hold them and look at them and study them. So very different from literary texts that will have been copied many times. And so we get them very much removed from the original composition. So let's see, the last branch of, well, there's probably many actually, two more, let's say. One is transmission of knowledge. Again, this is still thinking about moving from antiquity to early Islam, but I got very interested in thinking in so many different ways, so many different branches of knowledge that have been transferred, simply been studied. They evolve as they go along. So for example, the text that I did with Simon Swain on physiognomy, fantastic. It's really amazing seeing the transition, because there it is, a text composed by a guy called Polemon, who's in the inner circle of the Emperor Hadrian. He produces this text on physiognomy, so you know people's real character from external appearances. And then it just gets, it's fairly obscure for a while, but then once it gets translated into Arabic, suddenly you find it everywhere. Probably in Syriac before, actually, I should say. But nevertheless, once it gets into Arabic, obviously the language of empire, then it really takes off, and you find it then translated into lots of languages like Armenia, Georgian, Latin, all over the place. So it's fascinating just being able to follow these texts across time. And then the last area for me is archaeology. And actually both of these have been, it's been wonderful coming to the Institute for Study of the Ancient World here, because when I was looking for my first job after 9/11, it was very easy to get a job in Islamic history. So that's what I went for. And it was a great start at St. Andrews, which was a lovely place to work. But I've always had much broader interests. So coming to this institute at New York has been wonderful, where I'm with people more in the ancient world, and it's very much focused on studying transitions, interconnections across time. And in particular, we get a large budget to do excavation. So it's like being a child again, where people give me money so that I can go and dig things up and study them. So it's been a good journey, and I've been fairly lucky about the direction it's taken me. So István, I obviously can say more about my, since it's nearly 40 years of my life now, but I can't remember, do you let people ask questions, or how do we go ahead at this point?
Well, questions will come at the end. And
normally I feel it's boring people if I start talking too much about myself, so I normally always want to ask them.
You know, Robert, if you could tell us some of the greatest challenges, difficulties. I don't know if you want to talk about failures, such, because, and I'm asking this because, well, it's hard to see someone more successful, and yeah, especially in this, as I said, it seems so effortless, like playing piano for Mozart. So but so yes, if you haven't had any difficulties ever, I can believe that. To you, I can believe that. But if you had, it would be very reassuring for me, and I think for other people, to hear about anything.
Well, I always tell people, because they often ask why I seem to work on quite different things, and I always say, well, I get interested in a question, and then I try to answer that question, and so I write a book about it. But at the end, I always realize, well, I can't answer that question. Maybe I've helped push it along a little bit, but I still don't know the answer. So in a sense, every book is a failure. But it was also a lot of fun trying to push the answer along a little bit. I'll talk about one more thing that particularly fascinates me and has done from the beginning, which is historiography. And that underlies a number of the things I've written. The book on Theophilus of Edessa, trying to understand, in the end, although I gave it a name, which some people get annoyed at and criticize me for, but the reason for giving a text a name, even if it probably isn't, may or may not be the author, is it's just easier than just, it gives a focus. If I had just published it of, here's a unnamed Syriac chronicle, it wouldn't have looked very good, it wouldn't have sold, nobody would have bought it. So it gives it a nice focus. And it's actually a fascinating text, because there's so many texts, both in Christian and Muslim, both Arabic, Syriac, and Greek, that tie into this text, and it underpins a huge amount of our history writing across from the 7th, 8th centuries, that its tentacles reach out, not just into within groups. So Christian, it's used by Christian writers, but not just West Christian writers, also East Christian writers. You find bits of it in the Chronicle of Sirte, which is an East Syrian chronicle composed way up in southeast Turkey. So you can follow its tentacles all over. And there's always new. So somebody sent me a fantastic article recently, Mohammed Abul Qasim, I think his name is, that he noticed something. So this is a failure, if you like, but he noticed that a lot of the common material going way back is actually to be identified with a chronicle that gets called the Maronite Chronicle. Nobody really knows what it is, and it's not even a Maronite Chronicle, but nevertheless, that's what it gets called, for not good reasons. And he actually noticed for the pre-Islamic period anyway, this actually underpins the whole. So it's not just, for the early Islamic period, I hadn't noticed there's a massive kind of amount behind that. And this is to do with people's understanding of, at that time, there was a book came out called Antiquity Before Antiquity, which I quite liked, although I remember Patricia Kroner telling me it was a stupid name. But it is thinking what was antiquity to other people. And this led to a study I did recently on a guy called Kusta ibn Luka, who's writing in the late 9th century in Baghdad, translating a lot of serious medical texts, but he also writes history. And he translates quite a number of texts from Greek to Syriac and Arabic. And again, he's one of these people who, like Theophilus of Edessa, we don't actually know hardly anything about them, but they're very important. And it's kind of interesting, kind of probing and trying to work out their role and transmission through history. What he does is he translates a huge amount of material on ancient sources about particularly Greek and Latin myths. So Romulus and Remus is in there. Various Greek gods are in there. And it then this chronicle gets picked up by Agapius, who's a bishop of Manbij in the mid-10th century. And as an Islamicist, I'd always used that text from the 7th to 9th centuries and never really looked at the early parts of it. But it's got a huge section on ancient Greco-Roman history. And a lot of it actually is amazingly close. Kusta presumably was translating directly from certain texts, some of which we happen to have. And so we can see how close his translation is, Greek to Syriac. So historiography is I find it really fascinating because you can follow links across cultures, a text that you get. So Manbij, northern Syria, small little ancient town, but small little town. And then we have this bishop who finds one particular text is available to him. And then through this, he's actually, maybe he doesn't know this, but he's going back effectively about 3,000 years to get to some of the earliest material, which is getting preserved by sets of translators as you go along. So it's a fascinating way of following these little conduits through history across time. And that's something I can spend a long time doing. Theophilus of Edessa there's more and more people discovering as they get very old that actually they were autistic or something and didn't know they were. And I'm sure people studying my work. For the Theophilus, I had Theophanes, Chronicle of 1234, Michael the Syrian, Agapus, and a whole host of chronicles. And I'm trying to follow all the different links across them. So, but this is something that gives me a lot of pleasure anyway. Yeah, and it's so that's probably my top, I think, historiography, my kind of favorite thing to be doing. I don't really think of it in terms of failure as success. As you said in the beginning, Ishvan, it's something I like doing and I keep doing what I like doing. And hopefully it turns out to be something useful. I remember when I actually interviewed for the job here, the students also got to interview me. And one of them asked, what's your advice for getting a job in the future? And I said, well, I know I'm supposed to say things like you should think about, research a bit. What are the more popular things to study? What's looking at job rates? Who's getting the jobs in what areas? So I just kept doing what I really like doing. And the good thing is, if you really like doing the things, you put a lot of passion into it. So it actually potentially makes it easier for you to churn out good work, which, if you're lucky, will mean you get a good job at the end of it. But that could be just I was very lucky.
Yes, this is very positive, and I'm very, very happy with it. And it's great advice. And well, I've been always doing the same. It reminds me of my late father, who survived Second World War in the resistance and such things. And then often he said, well, these stories are only told by those who actually survived them. So obviously, yeah, you did what you did, and then you can say the advice. I hope it will work for everyone. I hope. But yeah, it's delightful to see that you are a great example of that someone just follows one's own interest and joy, and then manage to share so much of it with others. Thank you for that. So yeah, I think it's time if we can go now to your current playground and research, and then we can in the question and answer we can return to everything else, unless if there is someone who has a question right now, we can break the rules and have anyone saying anything. Okay, then let's go to the talk.
See that now? You still there, Esteban?
What I can see is probably your screen. Yeah, that's good. That's good. We can see it. Excellent.
Okay, so you can see that, yeah? And you can still hear me. Good. So, as I said, papyri is something that one of the elements of material culture that I find really fascinating. I started recently during COVID, really, with the Nasana papyri, which is a collection that was found in the 1930s, excavated by a guy called Harris Dunscombe Colt, who's actually from the family that, descendant of the family that invented the Colt revolver. And he had a lot of money and used that to go and do excavations in the Middle East and Cyprus. And so in one of the scenes at Nasana, they discovered these papyri. He has a lovely article about the discovery, which is, says a Bedouin boy, he could hear him shouting and saw him running down the hill, clutching some material in his hand. And he said, I just watched little bits of papyri flutter in the wind as he ran, which you kind of think, no, that's lost texts in a very literal kind of way. I was helped in that by the fact that the Israeli Antiquities Authority went and uploaded the whole of the British Mandate period archive onto the internet. And I discovered that whereas the Greek papyri went first to the British Museum and then to New York, illegally as it happened, Colt had no permission to take them to America. But the Arabic stayed behind in Jerusalem and got forgotten about. But in the archive that got uploaded to the internet, there were the photographs taken in 1935. And I found that there were 12 Arabic papyri there that weren't published. In fact, none of the Arabic-only texts were published. The publication of the Nasana archive is the Greek texts, and then Greek texts with some Arabic, so like the bilingual Entagia, for example. I don't know whether I can make a case for that being a bit prejudiced, but anyway, the Arabic got ignored. So I was publishing those. And then while I'd seen the originals later in Jerusalem, and then was shown the Khirbet Mird material. And I'd always assumed that Grohmann, when he looked at the material in 1960 and published his 100 texts from Khirbet Mird, that he'd published the whole archive, the whole of the Arabic collection. But that's not true. He picked the nice bits and left the horrible bits, which is a very sensible thing to do. He was a great papyrologist, very discerning. So, but I realized actually there's a lot of material that's unpublished. And then I also realized that almost none of the Greek material was published either, or the Aramaic for that matter, the Christian Palestinian Aramaic material. So this has been a kind of my new archive of papyri that I'm looking at, having finished the Nasana material. So Khirbet Mird is the Arabic name from the Syriac Marda for the site of Kastellion, which is just by, you can see from the map, just a little bit to the northeast of Masaba Monastery and west of Bethlehem. It's a very dramatic location with, the classic dry mountainous scenery. Here's a shot of the hill from the it's from the 1940s, this one. So looking up to the site of the monastery, which is placed right on top of this cone on the mountain. And there is a drone shot of that mountain. It's a very dramatic location. Must have been amazing to be a monk there, really constantly just staring out at these fantastic vistas. And this is a shot of the chapel, 1953, after the floor's been cleared. You see the Bedouin guards sitting out there, looking very romantic with his gun in the air. So a little potted history of the site. It's originally a fort built by John Hyrcanus, or his son maybe, Alexander. But it's a fairly small little thing until Herod the Great in 32 BC extends and reinforces it. Then actually Herod the Great's a major figure, and he uses it extensively for about 30 years. But then again, it's abandoned, and it's not until 492 AD that we hear of it again, when the abbot of Marsaba Monastery goes up there and prays at the ruins. We actually have a description of his visit there, and he converts it into a monastery. It was known as Kastellion, obviously it's the fort in Greek, and it goes into Aramaic and Arabic with the same name, the translation of the name Marda. So from 500 to 800 AD, it serves as a monastery. And that's the time of the papyri. The Greeks span that whole period, 500 to 800. The Aramaic is a bit tricky to date, but pretty much the same sort of thing, 6th to 8th century. And the Arabic papyri actually are more narrow. Grohmann wanted to place them, a lot of them, in the 7th century, but actually all the dated ones fall in a range of 705 to 750 AD. Obviously, some can be a bit earlier and some can be a bit later, but that's, and there's about 12 dated ones, so they're all in that first half of the 8th century. Now, in the aftermath of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, everything goes mad. People start running around looking everywhere in caves, trying to find more written material. And that's not just the Bedouin, it's also Israeli soldiers are sent out to look. There's foreigners from Europe and America over there kind of buying up stuff and running around looking. So it's a very exciting time, if you like. In 1952, some Bedouin from the Da'amara tribe, who actually were a major tribe in the Bethlehem area, I don't know if George mentions them, it'd be interesting to know. And they sell, or they bring a number of them, hoping to sell anyway, to the Director of Antiquities of Jordan, which controls this area at the time, a guy called Lancaster. And this gets a number of people very excited, in particularly a guy called Roland de Vaux, a Belgian monk, and he quickly gets a guy called Lippon to organize a mission to the site of Khirbet Mird to try and find more texts, which we do. We have a very nice description because it's in Flemish, it was kind of ignored, but it does actually explain the find spot, which must be somewhere here on you see those two blue arrows. The Belgian overseer, he writes up a description and he says it's the southeast of the monastery. So that's somewhere in that bit, one of those caves around there. He describes actually you have to clear a huge amount of material. And he describes clearing actually up to 20 feet of earth, which seems a huge amount. But anyway, they had to clear a lot of earth before they got down to the papyri. And they spend a while just clearing up all the bits and pieces. There's a hell of a lot of just loose fragments. When I went to see them in Jerusalem, they bought me a couple of boxes, which they look as though you would keep hamsters in them. It's just that lovely little, shredded, soft paper. It would have been just perfect for a little creature to bury itself in there. So a lot of them are really fragmentary. So there are hundreds and hundreds of fragments, but that's the good news story. But the bad news story is it's very difficult to read these tiny little fragments. So roughly the corpus that we're looking at is 500 pieces of Greek papyri. The catalogue that was produced but not published describes the contents as legal documents, letters, accounts, liturgical and biblical fragments, and then literary texts, which they don't really explain. This, on the good side, this stuff had not been looked at all really, but a project was started in 2017 to try and conserve this material, which is in Leuven, University of Leuven, and there's a very good Greek papyrologist, Lajos Berkes, who's actually working on them now. So there's good hope that these will see the light of day soon. Aramaic papyri, about 50 pieces. Quite a lot of the biblical fragments got published in Christina Müller-Kessler's book on the Christian Palestinian Aramaic papyri. And then Arabic papyri, they're around 400 of the more reasonable sized pieces, hundreds of very tiny fragments. And so all the dated fragments, as I said, 700 to 750. Yeah, some are definitely later. Some go, I would say, into the second half of the 8th century. These are legal documents, letters, accounts, and a few religious texts. Now, the first question, because I put it on the title page without an explanation, is this an archive, and what makes an archive? It's a kind of question that's being looked at more, some interest. A couple of very important people for Arabic papyri have looked at this. One is Petra Seiferstein, and the other is Marina Rostau, who did a very nice book, particularly on a lost archive, a Fatimid archive. And I think this will probably, well, does it fail or not? Well, let's say a couple of the things that you might think an archive ought to be is consistent in some way. Either it belongs to a single person, so it's the correspondence that they held with certain groups, perhaps while they were in office or whatever, or it may belong to a particular institution, so it's the dealings of that institution. So, for example, the Nassana papyri, there's kind of two sub-collections which plausibly could be archives. One is 5 generations of a kind of abbot's family, their correspondence, and then also a number from soldiers who were stationed at barracks there. Okay, reasonable. Khirbet Mird, it's assumed that it's a monastic archive. That's how it gets described in the small number of articles that have been dedicated to it. And a fair amount of the material in Greek and Aramaic would fit that description. Here's a nice prayer in Christian Palestinian Aramaic. Well, you may not be able to read it, but the bottom bit nicely ends up with the word Amen. It's a small little prayer. And in Greek, the stuff that has been published is generally the liturgical and biblical material. That's perfectly as you might expect. Lajos Berkes has paid attention recently to what was described as literary material, and he found a fragment of the Iliad. You might think, well, it might make you rethink a little bit, but it's not impossible for that to be a kind of teaching text for monks to learn literary Greek. But what is presumably probably a step too far is Muslim religious texts. Why are there lots of Muslim religious texts, legal texts, and so on? Surely you don't expect that in a monastic archive. You might potentially expect correspondence in the monastery, but not actual religious texts. So, for example, here's a Quran fragment. I was kind of very proud discovering this one. It's not much of a fragment, but then I suddenly saw the word qul on the second line. Thought, aha, what text uses the imperative of qala? Of course, once you've got one word, then as soon as you pull out your concordance of the Quran, you'll quickly find what text it belongs to. So here we have a little fragment of the Quran. It's not the first one. Kista, there's been unbelievably little written about the Arabic text from Khirbet Mird. I don't know why. Grohmann did his book in 1961, it was published. And since then, there were just 2 articles, which is very surprising. And no one made use of the text, which again, I find the Judean monasteries are so popular to write about. So, and it's the only one where we have papyri from a monastery, but nevertheless. But Kista, when he looked through Grohmann's book, he noticed that one text that Grohmann had thought was an account actually was a fragment of the Quran. So there's more than one. If there's 2, there might be more. And very interestingly as well, a fragment of the Sirah. This was actually used by Patricia Kroner because it appears to give a deviant date or a different date from Ibn Hisham's Sirah, shall we say, about the Battle of Badr. Badr is there in the middle. Zoom I can put there's Badr. It's mentioned a couple of times. So this isn't fully read. So anybody who's excited about finding a bit of the Sirah from a 8th century context, this plausibly is a bit later. They kind of followed Grohmann in assuming it must be very middle of Maya, but I don't know. It's a little bit later than some of the material, so it could be second half of the 8th century, but nevertheless early. So anybody who wants to look at it, I'll happily send you an image. And a lot of correspondence that actually makes up the bulk of the material that was edited by Grohmann. And again, anybody who likes the kind of nitty-gritty of legal proceedings, papyri are fantastic. This is, going on in real time, if you like. So this guy, Omar ibn Ubaidullah, he writes to Dir ibn Abdullah, who appears to be a superior, and he's writing, it says, together with Iyas bint Ma'ad al-Ma'arik, as in on her behalf, in a sense. And it concerns the fact that her husband, so she'd mentioned about the taking the of her nafaqah and muta'aha. So her husband had been withholding maintenance payments, if you like, and her goods. Yeah, so it's mata' and nafaqah here. And so he brought the 2 of them together, jama'atu bainahuma, and she asked him about, no, I asked him, the husband, so he brought the husband there, about what his wife said. The husband then agrees to give the mata' to her, but he still says he'll withhold the nafaqah. And so then the woman asks, she asks me that the woman, Al-Mara, the wife, that I bring him, Ishlabahu, Ilayk, to you, Dir. So Dir, as I say, being senior, he's being asked now to make another decision. So Omar sent the couple up to Dir, and Dir presumably made some decision because he'd then written ordering Omar to implement his decisions. So this is great. Lots of fantastic material. So I'm hoping some of you out there will take note of this and use it and restudy it, because it is very neglected. But to go back to the point of the archive, so I was stuck. This is another failure, if you like, Ishmael. Again, a great question, but I don't really know the answer to this. I have a suggestion, but how do we account for the presence of Christian and Muslim texts in the same archive? It can't be because the Christians abandoned the monastery and the Muslims took it over, or that the Muslims evicted the monks. The Christian texts, definitely they continue up to 800. And we actually have a number of hagiographical texts that make clear the monastery remained in use until at least this date. And the Arabic papyri are later, so it's not that the monks have been kicked out and then the Muslims start putting their material there. So, for example, the life of Stephen the Sabaite, which is he dies in 794. It's actually an uncle of his who becomes the abbot of Khirbet Mird, and he mentions it a number of times. So, and it's quite a few texts. So it's active until 800. And since the Arabic papyri don't go later than that, then it's not that the Muslims had simply taken over the monastery. There's two possible solutions. Right at the last moment, I added a third because I wanted to think about it. But two main ones, though. The site of Kastellion was shared between Christians and Muslims. So you might think of the cathedral churches of Damascus and Cordoba. Or the Muslim documents came from elsewhere, such as a nearby settlement where Muslims were present. And for some reason, maybe there was some disaster or something, they got stored up on Khirbet Mird, which was obviously a very safe sort of place. Yeah, someone actually suggested to me, the reason I put number 3 there, is that papyri, because it's inherently valuable, it can get reused. And actually, there's some examples of people buying up old papyri and then just reusing it themselves. So what I'll have to do is go back and see whether any evidence whatsoever of a Muslim text with a document of a different period on the reverse of it. But I'm happy to hear of more solutions. This is just me, my ideas, but I'm sure there's other solutions. There have been recent excavations at Khirbet Mird, and they found a Greek inscription, which has a kind of play on the Psalms, and also this rather beautiful Arabic inscription. I don't know how clearly visible it is there. There's actually a whole wall in plaster which has just huge amounts of writing on it. And you can see at the bottom here, there's like very scribbly sort of writing. But then there's a very lovely sort of text. It still only has the same sort of phrases as more rougher writing. I like to call these more personal inscriptions rather than graffiti, because the point is they're written by an individual just for himself, herself, or a community, but not for big public consumption, you know, not up on the lintel of a big building or anything. And it's still just an Allahumma ighfir sort of inscription. Please God forgive. In fact, it's ighfir liman qara'a, who read this text, waqala amin, and said amen, which doesn't actually need to, it could easily be Christian, actually, just simply that act. It's actually one text which is commonly used in both Muslim and early Muslim and older Christian material, where you ask the person passing by who reads this to think, say amen, say a prayer for them. So there's the chapel that I showed you earlier on this side that was cleared already in 1953. And then the new inscriptions were on this building that they don't actually know what it is. It's a 2-story building, very well constructed, actually. And the Greek inscriptions on one side, then there's a kind of dividing wall. There's lots of Arabic inscriptions on plaster here. So this could obviously at first make one think, aha, the building's being shared. You've got a Greek inscription here, you've got a dividing wall, and then Arabic inscriptions here. But as I said, the Arabic inscriptions there's not a single one that is necessarily Muslim. So it could easily have been written, therefore, by the monks at the monastery, who, you know, we know by in the 8th century, there's plenty of Arabophone monks. In fact, there probably were before Islam. It's just that we tend to, because we only have literary texts from about 750, we think that people are switching from using Greek and Syriac to Arabic, but it's probably not true. They were using Arabic before Islam in monasteries in Palestine as well. The option 2, that these texts are coming from elsewhere, the Muslim text, is supported by 2 papyri. One is PAPYRI Greek 9, which is an account, and it refers to a masjida here, M-A sigma, not very easy to see, but just about masjida, the gamma, and then the DA are quite clear. We don't know where it is, what it is exactly, but there's no evidence at all that there's any mosque at Khirbet Mird, so this is presumably elsewhere, some nearby settlement. Could it be the mosque where the Quran fragments, part of full, complete Quran works, were stored? And then there's this rather wonderful papyrus. I'm quite proud. If you ask me for failures, but it's also nice to talk about successes. And I like this one because it took a lot of detective work. I was actually helped by someone in the audience, May Shadell, who I see is here. And we both actually were discussing this text because, so there's an American Army commander, Commander Hutchison. He'd been involved in peace negotiations in around 1947 to 51. He was involved in the United Nations. And then he describes, we have his correspondence as it happens, that he bought a number of papyri and he took them back to America with him. And because he didn't really know what to do with them, which, you know, people just used to buy stuff, oh, this is nice. But then he thinks, well, what should I do with it? He writes to a woman called Florence Day, who is in the Islamic art department of the Metropolitan Museum. She's an assistant curator. And we have the correspondence, which is rather nice. It's in Leuven, to do with they have all the archive to do with Khirbet Mird, with the Belgian expedition to Khirbet Mird. And luckily, Commander Hutchison, he went to see the director of antiquities of Jordan before he took them out and got them photographed, and the photographs stayed separate from the papyri because I still haven't found these papyri yet. I got sidetracked into finding out about Florence Day, which is a rather interesting character. Yeah, so this is the correspondence. So this is like archives and archives. I've become an archivist. I find it really fascinating. So we happen to have what is an archive, and letters between these two and Florence Day. So this is her talking about the papyri. There were also Greek ones as well. But yeah, she says here that she would like to buy the Arabic papyri that he'd offered. And he then sends them along to her. And the question is then what she does with them. And then I started following Florence Day. Now, following in these days, a lot of you are very young, and I'm sure you know you can follow people on academia.edu and Snapchat and Instagram and so on. Unfortunately, this following is much more difficult. But Florence Day, yeah, so she was an art specialist. She worked at the Met, but then got rather summarily dismissed. You get the impression she was quite a tough-talking woman. And in the 1950s, that's, as a single woman, that's not so easy. She had her backers. She has an amazing early period. She actually works in the Institute for Advanced Studies when Oppenheimer is the director, and we have some letters between her and Oppenheimer. She becomes a Dumbarton Oaks scholar, the first actually of the intake of women. And I found this on the internet where the first junior fellows arrive and there's a celebration. And they give a quotation from the archives. And I always find it amazing, this, because I can't imagine writing about our postdocs like this, called Flossie by her colleagues. Above average height, square lines, her long blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, falls across her forehead in a heavy bang. Behind thick glasses, pair of blue and smiling eyes. Her teeth are white and even. It just is like an amazing thing. You definitely couldn't write about your fellows. In some ways, it wasn't just sexist, because there's also the young men. There's one guy they describe him as of having the slight appearance of a paunch appearing. So him, another guy, is being rather sinister. So there's a little bit of character assassination. But unfortunately, she then went to Harvard Art Museums, where there was a project to catalogue the holdings on Islamic art in the Boston area for teaching purposes and so on. I was talking about tying in tentacles, tying in different people. So Hamilton Gibb actually signs off on her post. So again, lots of amazing people brought in. And you can follow her to about, I went up to the archives kept in Harvard's Art Museum's archive, and you can follow her to 1962. But what happens then, I don't know. And also what happens to the papyri, I really don't know. The last thing I could find is that at the Rhode Island School of Design, they have some textiles, which they say came from her estate. So presumably she did actually give the various things she'd acquired over time to different institutions. So there's still some hope I'll get these papyri, the originals. But anyway, this is going back to, so luckily this was photographed and it's in Leuven, and they were kind enough to give me a high-res image of the papyrus. And it's a really fascinating text. It's the first bit's missing, so we don't have the Bismillah, and we don't have who it's from, unfortunately. We know it's to the people of, so this is the, you see the Ha Lam of Ahl, so it's the people of a particular village belonging to the Qura, and I think this must be Elia because you see a Lam Ya Aleph. There's not many places in that area that would end in Lam Ya Aleph except for Elia, so I think that's Elia. And they're from the Iklim of, this is a place probably Beit. It looks like a scene, printed scene, but that's not how you'd write it. So this is probably Beit here. So this is a very standard format for some sort of requisition document. The administrative center, they send out all these letters, these requests to various villages and so on to send food in kind, either directly and usually for the Muhajirun, the Arab Muslim, well, Fred, pick a term. I'm not going to prejudice the believers, armies, the armies anyway. But here it actually seems to be for the workers. He says, Fa'atu al-Omal, give the workers. I imagine this is Aladina. You can see the Aleph and the Lam here, and what would probably be the final, the tail of a noon. So Aladina, and then we just have Un at the end. So let's say Aladina Ya'malun, those who are working. And then Fi, and then I assume this is Darat Amir al-Mu'mineen. No Aleph, but medial Aleph is often not written. And the letter's nice and clear, the Dal, the Ra, and the Tamabuta. So the workers working on the palace of the Amir al-Mu'mineen. It's a very beautiful Umayyad imperial hand, relatively, with these lovely ascendants, and then the other letters written in a small proportion relative to the ascendants. And then we get the demand. They have to give the rizq, is the rizq, the Ra, Zain, tail of the Qaf, which tends to hang down a lot in this hand. These are almost identical to the Nasana requisitions as well, the same format. So you get the month, usually 2 months. This is Dhul Hijjah and Muharram. And then we get the Mi'ah of Modi, 100 Modi, it's the measure of wheat, Qamh here, Mithluhu, the same amount of, you see the Zayt of oil, and then zesties of grape juice, probably Tilwa here, and then some adas, some lentils here. So this is a very standard sort of requisition for foodstuffs to be given to workers. So what I find papyri was fascinating is that although it's a very, very detailed little piece, it's often telling you about a much bigger story. There has been a debate, a recent debate over whether there really was a palace of the Caliph, of the Umayyad Caliph in Jerusalem, or whether, so there's papyri in Egypt that mention the building of a palace, but it was argued that that's referring to a palace in Fustat, not in Jerusalem. So this makes clear, no, there definitely is a palace being built in Jerusalem. And it relates to another question, which is the status of Jerusalem. Was it an administrative center or not? And this, because you also have Gaza definitely seems to serve as some sort of administrative center. The Nasana Papyri refer to the governors of Gaza. So this is a hint, though, that Jerusalem is also important. This letter is coming out of Jerusalem and being sent to surrounding villages. So in summary, since I've got to my time and I'd like to leave time for questions, the papyri might be coming from a small village, so the one referred to in the papyri. Here, the people of the village of X. Unfortunately, of course, the crucial word is always unclear in papyri. But it could be coming from a village like this, that the papyri are coming. This may be where the mosque was, and maybe some catastrophe happens, and Khirbet Mird is known to be a very safe, secure place, so the papyri get deposited there. It could, of course, be after the monastery itself has gone out of use, so it's just that a cave is being used by a number of communities for deposition, for safe storage. And the second conclusion I want to make is that there's some great stuff in this collection, in this corpus of papyri, so I hope it'll get better used. I hope to publish some myself. I'm hoping all the Greek texts will start to be made known once they're conserved and being published. But yeah, there is some fascinating material there. I'm hoping someone out there will suddenly realize, wow, papyri are cool. Maybe they can work on all the difficult ones that we've left behind. So thank you. I'll see how the questions go first, Istvan. I have more to say, but
well, I'm inclined to let you continue if there is something what you would really like to add. I don't worry about time that much.
Yeah, why don't we have some, because you do have a lot of experts in your audience here, and if the questions could lead to some, because I can give longer answers as things arise. So I spent time reading this material, but
good. So
I'll just talk randomly.
okay. Well, thank you very much. I just wanted to say two things. I love this presentation also because I have students who come to me and they are really worried about having an argument. And I'm telling them, well, just go discover, read the source, just follow the source, and then you will have your argument. It will come. It's just not, yeah. It's just enjoy the discovery. And your talk was really a great presentation of that how research leads us into completely unexpected ways to make a research about Florence Day, whom you probably didn't know before, life and hair. So this is fascinating, and I think it's really a good example of not to overbury a publication and yeah, forms of how to publish it. It's just, yeah, so that's the first thing. The other thing I wanted to say before we go for the questions, and which also means that I will close the recording, is to call everyone's attention to the next majlis, which will be also a great scholar and wonderful person, Fozia Bora. And I'm not sure whether this is anyone's research, what she will talk about. It's such an unusual and exciting topic. A Somali village in colonial Bradford, 1904, a counter-archival study. And I will send out the description for it. It is really fascinating. I think the title doesn't do justice of the research itself. Yeah, so that's again, it's she finding something which is completely different from her usual research and just following the thread. Okay, so I thank you again, Robert, and everyone, and I close the recording, and then we will go for the questions. Please, I will ask you either to put into the chat that you have a question. Rather, don't put the question. It's enough if you say you want to have a question, and then I will give you the word. Unless you cannot you don't have a microphone or something, then you can of course type it in, or raise your hands on the or raise your digital hand. Okay, so I'm stopping the recording just a second.